From a distance, the cliff appears lifeless, just layers of stone shaped by erosion and time. Nothing suggests that people ever lived here. And yet, inside this wall, an entire community once existed. Not temporarily, not in hiding, but as part of a long-term, carefully organized way of life. What we now call Cliff Palace was built directly into the rock face of Mesa Verde. Hundreds of people lived here for generations, high above the canyon floor, accessible only by narrow paths and wooden ladders. Choosing a place like this meant accepting constant difficulty, cold winters, strong winds, limited access, isolation from the land below. So the decision to live here wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. The cliff provided something the surface could not: security, visibility, control over movement in and out of the settlement. From this height, approaching threats could be seen early. The narrow entrances limited access. The stone itself became a barrier. But survival requires more than protection. A community needs food, water, warmth, and stability over time. What makes this settlement remarkable is how intentionally those needs were addressed. The space was not carved randomly. Every room had a function: living areas, storage spaces, ceremonial chambers. The orientation of the cliff mattered. Sunlight reached the dwellings during colder months. In summer, the rock offered shade and relief from heat. This balance was not improvised. It reflects planning, experience, and adaptation. Life here followed a rhythm: daily tasks, shared responsibilities, rituals that reinforced social structure. Children were born here. Families grew here. This was not an emergency refuge. It was a permanent home. And that leads to a deeper question. How did daily life actually function in a place like this? Understanding that reveals why this settlement worked and why people were able to remain here for so long. Living here required more than strong walls and high ground. Everyday life had to function within strict limits of space and access. Food was central to everything. Without reliable storage, life in this environment would have been impossible. Rooms carved deep into the cliff were used to protect supplies: grain, dried foods, seeds meant for future seasons. The stone kept temperatures stable, cool enough to prevent spoilage, dry enough to protect against moisture. Cooking areas were positioned carefully. Smoke needed to escape without filling the living spaces. Ventilation shafts allowed air to move through the settlement, carrying heat and smoke away. Water access shaped daily routines. There were no rivers inside the cliff. Water had to be carried from sources below, making every trip a calculated effort. Movement through the settlement followed clear patterns. Narrow paths controlled traffic. Ladders could be removed or repositioned. Access points were never wide or exposed. This wasn't inconvenience. It was control. Children learned where they could move, where they could not. Everyone understood how the space worked. At the center of the community were circular rooms known as kivas. These spaces were not used for daily tasks. They served social and ceremonial purposes. Here, decisions were made. Rituals reinforced shared identity. Stories were passed down. These spaces connected people to one another and to something beyond daily survival. Light played an important role. Openings were positioned to capture sunlight at specific times. Certain rooms remained darker and cooler. Others warmed quickly during the day. This balance created zones within the settlement: work areas, resting spaces, communal rooms. Nothing was accidental. Even movement between levels mattered. Climbing ladders was slow. It forced awareness. It reduced chaos. In moments of danger, that same structure could slow intruders and protect those inside. But most days were not defined by threat. They were defined by routine: grinding grain, preparing food, maintaining storage, teaching children. Life continued, day after day, inside the rock. And yet, this way of living demanded constant effort. Every resource was limited. Every mistake had consequences, which raises an important point. For a system this demanding to work, it had to be sustainable over time. And that depended on something deeper than architecture.
For a system like this to work, it had to do more than function day to day. It had to hold up over years, season after season, generation after generation. Living inside a cliff reduced exposure to many dangers, but it also created new pressures. Every resource was limited. Every decision mattered. Food production could not happen inside the settlement. Fields were located far below, on the canyon floor. That meant long climbs, repeated trips, constant coordination. Harvests had to be planned carefully, enough to last through winter, enough to survive years when conditions were poor. Storage helped, but it had limits. If yields dropped too low, the system began to strain. Water was another constant concern. Carrying it uphill required time and energy. During dry periods, that effort increased. Daily life depended on balance. Too many people and resources thinned, too few, and labor became insufficient. Social structure played a critical role. Responsibilities were shared. Knowledge was passed down. Everyone understood their role within the community. This wasn't just architecture. It was organization. The design of the settlement enforced cooperation. Narrow passages limited movement. Shared spaces required interaction. Isolation was not possible here. That closeness strengthened bonds, but it also meant that stress was shared. Environmental changes added pressure. Long droughts affected crops. Unpredictable weather increased uncertainty. Archaeological evidence suggests these conditions became more frequent over time. Food security weakened. The margin for error shrank. Still, the community adapted. They adjusted planting strategies. They relied more heavily on stored supplies. They leaned on social cohesion. But adaptation has limits. A system built around precision works best when conditions remain stable. When those conditions shift, even well-designed solutions begin to falter. Life inside the cliff was resilient, but not invulnerable. And as pressures mounted, the question was no longer how people lived here, but how long they could continue to do so.
Eventually, the balance that sustained life inside the cliff began to shift. Not suddenly, not through a single event, but through gradual pressure that accumulated over time. Environmental conditions grew less predictable. Extended droughts reduced crop yields. The effort required to maintain daily life increased. Every journey between the canyon floor and the settlement became more costly. Food had to be carried farther. Water required more labor. Mistakes became harder to recover from. At the same time, social pressures intensified. A system built on cooperation depends on stability. When resources shrink, even strong structures are tested. Archaeological evidence suggests that people did not abandon this place in panic. There are no signs of violence, no indications of sudden destruction. Instead, the settlement appears to have been emptied deliberately. Rooms were left intact. Ceremonial spaces were not destroyed. Valuable knowledge was carried away. This suggests planning, a decision made over time rather than a reaction to immediate danger. Communities likely began relocating gradually, moving closer to more reliable water sources, reducing dependence on long vertical travel, adjusting to changing environmental realities. Life inside the cliff had worked remarkably well, but it required conditions that no longer existed. What remains today is not a failed experiment. It is evidence of adaptation. The people who lived here understood their limits. They recognized when a system that once ensured survival was no longer sustainable. That decision reflects awareness, not collapse. The settlement was not abandoned because it failed. It was left behind because its purpose had been fulfilled. For generations, it provided protection, stability, and community. When those needs changed, so did the way people chose to live. Standing here now, it is easy to focus on the stone. But the true story lies in the choices that shaped this place. The planning, the cooperation, the willingness to adapt. Life inside the cliff was never meant to last forever. It was a response to a specific moment in time. And when that moment passed, the people moved on, leaving behind one of the most remarkable examples of human organization and resilience.